Scott, welcome to another episode of our podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Mark.
Yeah, this one is on a topic that, as somebody who comes from the patient side, has always been important because, coming from the world of cystic fibrosis, where for so many years there wasn't a drug or anything to treat the disease, you're always hoping and grasping at sort of what's out there, and you see early stage research and you get so hopeful. And so today, to talk about the accelerated approvals program, I think is a really important topic, obviously for the whole industry, but especially for patients and patient communities.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. As you know, the FDA has a number of programs to try to encourage and incentivize research in various areas, and this is obviously a very important one. And it tries to balance, I think, the need for evidence for these medicines, along with, as you were just pointing out, the need for access to new therapies for patients who have, especially patients with severe or substantial illnesses. And so I'm really looking forward. We've got a couple of experts with us today, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with them and learning more about it. The program has actually had a little bit of controversy in terms of its operations over the last couple of years or so, and so I'm looking forward to diving into that and learning about that as well.
Well, great. Well, let's welcome our guests. We have Bridget Doherty, who's the Director of Access and Policy Research at Johnson & Johnson Innovative Medicine, and Jeff Allen, who's the President and CEO of Friends of Cancer Research. So welcome, Bridget and Jeff, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you.
Yeah, why don't we start with a sort of a softball question with introductions from both of you in terms of like what you do, and tell us a little bit about the organization, and please help get everybody up to speed.
And Bridget, I'm particularly intrigued by the new J&J Center. If you could elaborate on that a little bit, it seems to be an interesting development within the industry.
Sure. Happy to start us off. And again, it's an honor to be here. As you said, I'm a director on the Access and Policy Research team at Johnson & Johnson. And what my team does is we're a group of multidisciplinary researchers who generate evidence and evaluate data around healthcare policy. At J&J, we believe just like rigorous science is essential to developing transformative medicines and establishing patient care, that solid evidence is just as critical when we're talking about creating and improving healthcare policies. Because if you think about it, healthcare policies, ultimately the end user is always the patient, right? So it's very important that we get those right. And the goal of my team is to develop that evidence and data to support an ecosystem where policy decisions, again, are driven by that data and evidence, right, helping to improve kind of access, affordability, and innovation. And our commitment to that, as Scott alluded to, is we're really excited. We just launched the J&J Center for U.S. Healthcare Policy Research. It's a dedicated space and team where we're focusing on these original studies like we'll talk about today. We're publishing evidence-based insights and blogs on recent events. And again, to keep that conversation, because there's so much conversation going on, grounded in that data and evidence. And we're really excited and proud of it.
Yeah, but I think that's wonderful. I'm glad to hear J&J is taking up that mantle. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, Jeff.
Yeah, want to introduce yourself, your organization?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to join the discussion today. My name is Jeff Allen. I'm the President and CEO of Friends of Cancer Research, which is a policy and advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. We're almost 30 years old, but for the majority of that time, our organization has been focused on a pretty straightforward mission, doing what we can to advocate for policies and support research that accelerates the pace of developing new medicines for patients. And we do that through a variety of different projects. The majority of our work is focused on the regulatory arena, so working specifically on FDA policy, thinking about ways that we can ensure that the policy is keeping pace with the science. And then, of course, in oncology, fortunately, the science is moving at a pretty remarkable pace. And in order to realize sort of the promise behind that research and ensuring that it can reach patients in a timely fashion, making sure that the policy is reflective of that is quite important. So we have a number of different initiatives looking at specific policy, but also unique research partnerships that we manage, looking at things like endpoint validation, performance of diagnostic testing, the utilization of AI, all geared toward trying to accelerate clinical trials in order to compress the research process so that it doesn't take quite as long, and hopefully we can address those unmet needs that unfortunately still exist for many cancers.
Yeah. Great. Well, welcome, Jeff. That sounds like very interesting and important work. So thank you. Mark, why don't we start with just a little bit of context and some of the history here. Bridget, I'll ask you first. So just clue us in a little bit here about the accelerated approval process or program. When did it originate? And what was the original intent of it?
Sure. The accelerated approval program is a real important pathway that the FDA, you kind of alluded to it earlier, uses to help patients, and it enables patients to get earlier access to promising treatments for conditions that are very serious or life-threatening, often unmet need, great unmet need. There's probably little to no other options. It was created back in 1992, largely in response to the HIV/AIDS crisis, when there was an urgent need to speed up the process to get promising treatments to patients. And then it was codified in 2012. It's especially useful in areas like oncology, which we'll talk about today, where if you waited for the process to run its normal course, that could take years. And for these patients, in many cases, that's years they don't have.
Great. So tell us a little bit more about how it works then.
Sure. Well, when we say accelerate, it's a multifaceted program, many aspects, but I'm going to focus on two key ways when we talk about that acceleration. First, it allows the FDA to base approval on what's called a surrogate endpoint. A surrogate endpoint is something that's reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. It could be a biomarker, a lab result, a physical change. Classic surrogates, not even used in the accelerated approval, cholesterol and blood pressure, right? They're indicators of cardiovascular healthcare. In cancer, it could be something like tumor shrinkage, not in all cancers, just in some, because that might be strongly associated with better quality of life or survival, right? It's important to note these surrogate measures were not picked out of the air. Groups like Jeff help us to make sure that they're really good, but they're backed by evidence and they're worked upon and agreed upon with the FDA. The second way it speeds things up is it's allowed drugs to be approved earlier in the development process. Normally, you would go through a phase 3 trial, and that's what we call regular approval. Accelerated approval allows access, in this case, usually after phase 2, and rather than waiting for that phase 3 data. So on average, it's about 3 years, or give or take, depending on the product. And what it means, of course, patients have earlier access. However, again, key to remember, companies and sponsors, we still have to do what we call that confirmatory trial, right? That's often enrolled or started even upon the access given and accelerated approval. If those trials confirm the benefit, say they show it reduces mortality or you see slow disease progression, then the FDA converts it to what we would call regular approval, like other products.
Right.
If the trials don't confirm benefit, the FDA has a couple of mechanisms. It could ask the sponsor to withdraw. It could ask for another trials. If necessary, they can initiate formal withdrawal proceedings. And then some cases, the actual sponsor will withdraw the trials. But that's how it works.
Yeah. Great.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
I want to turn to Jeff real quick. He says, help us understand from, I know the Forensic Cancer Research, it's as Bridget said, important to especially oncology and the research there. Tell us a little bit about the trends for the usage of the program today and what it's been over time. Can you sort of go so we again understand a little bit more about the program?
Yeah, sure. And I'd invite you to visit our website. We have sort of a catalog of expedited approvals under a module called Data-Driven Insights. But a couple of highlights, pulling from those findings. When you look at sort of the past 30 plus years of accelerated approvals, it's been over 350 drug indications that have gone through this pathway. Over time, over 60% of those have been in oncology. But of course, as Bridget mentioned, other areas such as infectious diseases have been an area that have benefited from this expedited pathway. And in recent years, we've seen that the accelerated approval pathway has been able to be expanded into other therapeutic areas as well, such as neurology. But still, even looking more recently in the past 5 or so years, over 80% of the approvals given, the accelerated approvals given are in oncology. So it's a very important program for providing access and expediting the development of oncology drugs. When you look a little bit closer and dive into the details, so as I said, over 80% of the accelerated approvals in the last 5 years are oncology. So we're talking over 230 different indications. Of those, over the history of the program, not even in the last 5 years, but looking over the last 30 years, of all of those drugs that have received an accelerated approval for a cancer indication, over half of them, over 55% of them, have been converted to a full approval. So as Bridget explained, this means that they have performed and completed their confirmatory studies and confirmed the long-term benefit associated with the intermediate endpoint on which they were originally approved. Now, contrary, there have been about 15% of all of the oncology accelerated approvals have been withdrawn from market. So in that case, of course, they have completed their confirmatory studies, and there were indications that the benefit originally seen with the earlier, smaller trials did not confirm, and so the sponsor and the FDA worked together to withdraw them from withdraw that indication from the drug label. So this leaves about 30% of drugs in sort of this pending category. And I think that's an important area to focus, and often one that gets attention given the importance of developing the confirmatory evidence. But when you look at the time period that it takes in order to perform an additional clinical trial, unfortunately, this information isn't going to be instantaneous. It often requires a separate clinical trial to be set up and be conducted in order to confirm the benefit. And when you look at those that have been converted, those take a little bit over 3 years on average to develop the confirmatory evidence. For those that have been withdrawn, those often occur within about 4 years. So that's about the time frame that it takes to generate this additional information. So in looking at sort of that 30% of pending applications, over half of those have actually been approved within the last 3 years. So it might be unrealistic to expect that the information has been generated in order to confirm benefit. But there is that component of about 15% of those approvals that it probably is a good area to think about different processes. And that's been one that policymakers have been focused on as well, in terms of generating the information after a substantial period of time on the market to better understand whether this is providing benefit to patients and the benefit could be confirmed, or whether additional action needs to be taken. Maybe the one last thing I'll say about some of those pending ones is that in some cases, the field is just moving so quickly that after 3 or 4 years, after a drug is on the market, there may be other therapies for that particular therapeutic indication that have come onto market and shown benefit or even improvements over those originals. So they in some ways might even be irrelevant to some extent, which makes it very difficult to complete these confirmatory trials if these drugs are not a predominant use in clinical practice any longer.
Yeah, but again, that also means that during that time, it was a stair step for those patients to get to whatever might be coming down the pipeline. So, Jeff, real quick, if you were to like pick 1 or 2 drugs so people could understand, like what is like the most impactful drug that has been gone through this process that really made a difference for patients?
Yeah, there's really a number of them, because a hallmark of the component is that it addresses an unmet medical need for a serious and life-threatening illness. So there's oftentimes not other therapy available. But when you think about drugs that have been transformative to the field, drugs like Gleevec for certain kinds of leukemia, for example, have gone through this program and have resulted in substantial extension of life for patients that you could imagine if it would have been held from being able to enter the market based on some of those early substantial benefits that were seen in some of those smaller trials. It could have taken years longer to develop the information in order to reach more patients. And there's examples that span across a variety of different blood cancers, like multiple myeloma, where there's been numerous different advances that have been enabled through this pathway, or even classes of drugs like immunotherapies that have really kind of transformed cancer treatment as compared to where it was several decades ago, that has been shown to be effective treatments in many different cancers. When you look across the program, this has resulted in on the magnitude of years of these therapies being able to reach patients, as opposed to if they would have had to wait on their full long-term overall survival assessments.
And for this program, Jeff, is the approval, how central is the surrogate endpoint? Are these all drugs that were studied initially with a surrogate endpoint? Is that right?
Yeah, so they're all approved based on a endpoint that's reasonably likely to predict benefit. And that's been one of the reasons that it has been so important in cancer, because the understanding of the underlying biology is really there to know things that, like slowing of progression or reduction of tumor size have been shown multiple times over in various different cancers to be closely associated with long-term benefits like survival.
Yeah. And then the confirmatory trials, are those always with the, hard endpoints, the primary endpoints like long-term survival?
Yeah, those typically are going to be more of the longer endpoints around how a patient is function, feeling, or surviving. But that becomes complicated as well in many cases because of the duration that it may take in some types of cancers for those endpoints to actually be able to sufficiently read out, or if the standard of care changes during that intermediate time. So it's a very dynamic process that is one that I think speaks to the complexity and the occasional difficulties that have been encountered with the program, and how FDA has to sort of actively manage it as data is being developed.
I can imagine this is, from the regulator's perspective, from the FDA perspective, this is not the most straightforward thing to try to administer. Have they gone on the record generally with kind of how they think it's going, or whether they think the program is working well or needs modifications?
Yeah, well, certainly, I don't want to try and speak for the FDA, but they,
Sure.
There have been folks that have, published assessments based on the data that they have around the magnitude of benefit in terms of both the therapeutic effect, but also the time savings that has come from this program. So I think they see it as, really kind of a tool in the toolbox in order to, do their part to be able to identify effective drugs that are active, early on in development, that warrant some sort of regulatory action, because that benefit risk assessment that's sort of critical to all of the decisions that they make begins to tip when you start to see some of these early endpoints pointing toward having a substantial effect on a tumor directly. And it gives them the ability to take action to be able to do that, but also the authorities to require additional information over time.
Bridget, I want to turn to you real quick. In spite of some of the successes that Jeff mentioned, there's been some criticisms of this program. So, could you help us understand where they're coming from and what are some of those concerns?
Yeah, I would say there's like a critique narrative that's been evolving, at least in the last 5 to even 6 years. And the story is kind of that the program is less than data, less than time, less than rigor. One of the first things is in 2020, there was a JAMA editorial, and it was like terms were used that the FDA has been increasingly willing to accept less evidence, rely more heavily on surrogate endpoints, and shorten review times. So that designation, all the complexity we just talked about, kind of making that sound like a drawback.
Right.
More recently, specifically to what Jeff was speaking, there's been growing skepticism, at least we've seen, around the surrogate endpoints themselves. Just a few months ago, there was a publication where the authors used language such as unproven clinical benefit or only likely to clinical benefit, which, for us, what we want to clarify is, again, they need to be reasonably likely to predict clinical benefits, and there's science behind them. They're not randomly chosen. So that's been one. Jeff kind of alluded to it. Another thing is how confirmatory trials are designed. This is rapidly changing, very complex. There's been critiques that maybe the confirmatory trial is being done in a different population, or there's a crossover, making it, to them harder to designate any effect to the trial itself. There's ethical and practical challenges there, especially when you have a drug showing promise for people with few to no options. To randomize them to a placebo-controlled trial is both, practically different, and there's ethical issues as well. And I think it's key to make sure that the FDA is not confirming something just because it was difficult. They're still standing and looking at the evidence. And then there's the issue of time. Jeff kind of alluded to it, how much time it takes from the confirmatory trial. I think there were some issues, but there's also, these are rapidly changing and evolving issues and diseases. Some people have critiqued, if we don't have a readout in X amount of years, that equates to there's no evidence of effect. Whereas, as Jeff alluded to, these are diseases that's going to take time for the data to mature. So it not being mature does not mean it's not working. And if you did take them through the normal process, those are years that the patient might have to wait that they might not have. So those are some of the key critiques that we've heard.
Yeah. I'm going to jump in here for a little, so I'm professionally, I'm a, drug pricing and access person. And I wonder, as I listen to that, Bridget, how much of the, and maybe hard to tell, how much of the criticism is rooted actually in the cost of the medicines? If these medicines were free, would we still be debating the merits of an early access program like this for patients with serious illness? Anyone take that? Hard to know, but I don't know. It makes me wonder, right? Because as I just listen on the face of it, it feels like, if I were the patient or for my family or whatever, if we put the cost side aside for the moment, and I know that's just an exercise or whatever, but okay.
I do think that is a challenge that adds tension to this discussion. It's no surprise that there has been debate over drug prices for the last several years, and in some cases, oncology is a component of that. But I think the importance of the program is really around also, trying to balance the uncertainty. And there's uncertainty with the evidence about the drug, which I think does sort of get tangled into aspects of affordability and price and access. And then there's uncertainty around the illness, and I think that's a key component. With these drugs intended to treat a serious and life-threatening illness, oftentimes for which there's not an available therapy. So this is sort of providing an alternative option or filling a void. So it is an important component of that, and I don't say that to cast the cost discussion aside, but all of this sort of needs to be taken into context, and hopefully can recognize that these therapies are filling a void. So we need to also do our part to make sure that there's access. Addressing cost being a component of that.
Yeah, and Bridget, you're, in spite of all these criticisms, right? Or given the fact that all these criticisms are happening, I know your organization is now data-driven, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you undertook a review. I know results were published in the Journal of the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. Can you tell us at a high level, like, why did you undertake this? How did you go about it to pull all this information together?
Sure. Well, as a policy researcher, surrounding the critiques were also calls for policy reform and changes. And when you start saying, let's change a program, my first question as a policy researcher is, well, what is it doing or what has it done at the patient level before we start tinkering with it, right?
Yeah, benchmark it.
Exactly. And when we started to look into the existing literature, what we found was most of the evidence or discussion was anecdotal. It was focused on the number of approvals and the number of withdrawals. Or it was holding up individual case studies, many of which we would say might be outliers, maybe not all, as indicative of the program, representative of the program overall. And that's what we were finding. What we saw that was completely missing was a population level assessment of the program's real world impact. And that gets stuck out to us. And as I said, our purpose now is that evidence generation policy making. So that's what motivated our study. So we set out to quantify the benefit of the program, specifically in oncology, for exactly what Jeff said. It's the majority of the products going through it. But also, oncology gave us a metric that we could align across the board, and that's life years, right? That's what people want. If you have cancer, that's what policymakers understand, and it's uniform across cancer, where some of the other diseases, it's a little more complicated. So we focused on that because it could speak to the patient impact. We conducted a retrospective real-world evidence study to look at what was gained or lost because of that earlier access granted by the program compared to standard of care, okay? We pulled overall survival data that was available for every oncology product that we could find that was approved under the Accelerated Approval Program from 2006 to 2022, including those that were drawn. I think that's key. Yeah. There's not cherry picking. If it went through, we found the data.
Right.
Then we matched that with uptake data to see how many patients were actually on it. And then with that, we modeled the life years, again, gain or loss because of that earlier access. And we feel that gave us a much clearer picture of the program's impact at a larger scale.
Mhm. Okay, so what's the punchline? What'd you find?
There's the time, you got it. Across the 69 cancer indications for which we found overall survival data, we estimated that the program added an additional 263,000 life years were gained because of that earlier
Say that
access.
again, how much?
263,000 life years were gained because of that
Wow.
earlier access. That's our estimate across 911,000 patients. Again, and that's what we were measuring, the earlier access from the accelerated approval to either the conversion or the withdrawal or whatever decision was made. When we looked at those that had an orphan designation, we saw a gain of 145,000 life years in about 264,000 patients. That was a 16.5% improvement over the standard of care. And one of the most interesting findings, I think, is even for the treatments that were eventually withdrawn, there was still a net yet life year gain that we found.
Wow.
Jeff, yeah, how would you react? You're a patient advocacy professional. How do you react to that?
Yeah, I think any policy, after it's enacted for some period of time, it's worth, taking a look whether it's achieving the benefits that it intended to achieve. And, studies like this that show at a population level that there's a longitudinal benefit over time that is quite substantial, I think is a recognition that perhaps at time this has not been a perfect program. Not every drug approved by accelerated approval has confirmed benefit, and some might argue that if that were the case, perhaps it wouldn't be being implemented as it was intended. But as a whole, across a population over many years, it shows that there is a net benefit being achieved by providing earlier access to these drugs that treat a serious illness like cancer.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff, so help us understand, one of the things I want to go back to this topic of the surrogate endpoint, and there's a lot of cancer. Then now we're looking at cancer biomarkers. You were part of a group that recently published data on this. Can you tell us a little bit about how and why that happened, and what is the marker, and how does it work?
Sure. So I think this kind of goes back to the idea that technology is advancing so much that it's enabling different ways of evaluating disease. And so in this case, what we were examining through this project is called circulating tumor DNA, or ctDNA for short. And this is a genetic substance that is naturally shed from cancerous cells that can be detectable in a blood test. And some preliminary studies have been indicated that a change in ctDNA may be associated with the effect of the treatment. And so what we set out to do, given that there were a number of different studies that were smaller exploratory studies that evaluated the association with ctDNA change and treatment outcomes, we've aimed to try and aggregate that data together on a larger scale. Certainly believe that endpoint development needs to be a rigorous science, that there needs to be processes in place to ensure that should an alternative endpoint be identified, that the underlying evidence be rigorously generated in order to show those associations with outcomes. And so that's what we've set out to do. In partnership with about 12 different companies that have donated data to this project, we've aggregated information across nearly 24 recently completed clinical trials in order to ask that question, whether change in ctDNA in response to therapy was an indicator of long-term benefit. And what we found by looking across a various sets of different tumor types and across different drug classes was that in large part, a reduction of ctDNA that can be observed within the first several weeks of treatment. So within 7 weeks of treatment initiation, a significant reduction in ctDNA is associated with an improvement in long-term survival. So those patients that experience a reduction tend to live longer. And by doing this across multiple different trials, and looking across multiple different drug classes, we're trying to build the foundational evidence to best design what those studies need to look like into the future in order to validate the use of this tool as a clinical trial endpoint. When you think about the time that could be saved by having a measure that within the first few weeks following treatment could indicate whether the drug is beneficial or not, as compared to have to wait months or years in order to evaluate that, it has the opportunity to really accelerate the pace of research and identifying those most promising compounds to move forward into subsequent clinical studies.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so what would be the likely next step for this work, Jeff?
Yeah, so we'll be reading out the last round of results in a couple of different tumor types that we've gathered data on in early next year, and then are beginning to work with various different researchers and companies around the design of those prospective trials based on the knowledge that we've gained through this particular project, to ultimately work closely with our regulatory colleagues at the FDA to make sure that we're trying to answer those questions around sort of what's the appropriate time frame for sampling ctDNA, what's the magnitude of change that needs to be observed in order to most closely correlate and predict survival benefits, and what are sort of the performance of the tests need to be moving forward in order to sort of set a standard around the characterization of this molecular endpoint as a potential tool in clinical studies.
Yeah, and I guess the hope would be that eventually it would become a validated surrogate endpoint.
Yeah, if the data supports it and we observe a strong association with overall survival at multiple different trials, we see it at the patient level. Now we're looking at the trial level in order to ultimately get to identifying sort of those scenarios where it may be most beneficial to be used as an early endpoint.
And how long will that process take, just generally, do you think? Just a guess. So.
Yeah, it depends on the tumor types that we're looking at. In one case, there has been some indication that in particularly advanced diseases that are hard to measure by traditional imaging, things like bone metastasized prostate cancer, for example, could be a huge benefit to have a molecular test. And that may be shorter to read out because of the trajectory of the disease. But I think where this endpoint could be most useful is thinking about earlier stage therapies, where the cancers are most treatable, but the clinical trials take longer. And that's sort of a good problem to have in oncology, that as we've gotten better at treating certain cancers, people have lived longer. That also means that the trials take longer to complete, and all the more reason that we need to look at some of these earlier endpoints to be able to identify those potentially promising compounds sooner.
Wow, that's amazing. When you think about that and what that could mean, obviously that could also change how fast accelerated approvals could come into the process with the FDA. And Bridget, I sort of want to turn to you because our podcast is about access and affordability, right? Like patient access and affordability. So I just want to turn to that because we mentioned earlier, this is giving a patient a chance to get into access to these drugs much earlier. But when you dive into it with the FDA, how do they actually look at it? Like from their perspective, is it a regular approval? Help us understand how that all works.
Sure. Thank you for that question, because I think this is a key area that needs to be clarified. This is not a shortcut. Okay. This is a different path to the same goal. Safe and effective therapies for patients who need them most. Okay. It's just a bit of a different process. The FDA actually applies the same evidentiary standard as it does for what we would call regular approval. It still has to be safe and it still has to be effective. What the difference is again, that area of more uncertainty. Yes, there's more uncertainty, but that's the trade-off for the faster access. And again, we're talking about potentially life-saving treatments for patients who have little to no other options. And like we like to think that our data shows that trade-off has been effective with some of the decisions that they have made. The other thing you said, like the idea of it being temporary. What I find with the accelerated approval program, a lot of times there's terminology that's it's correct, but it gives it a flavor that maybe is not true. The term I would like to use is more, it's confirmatory, right? It's still approved, it's still valid, it's still safe. That confirmatory trial confirms it and it converts to a regular approval. And I think that's different, and maybe helping patients and others who might question the idea of it being like, temporary or not the real thing. And that's not the case.
Or experimental. It's not experimental.
Correct.
Okay. And so are there any limitations then in terms of like promotional activities or anything like that for the companies during that period?
That is not my area of expertise.
Okay.
Can't speak to that. I don't know if Jeff, you can.
Yeah, I think for most accelerated approvals, the sponsors are required to submit any marketing material associated with the drug in advance of the approval. And I think there's been a conscious effort in order to facilitate the development of timely post-market evidence to get those confirmatory studies done. And I think that's a really important component of balancing that uncertainty. And we've seen even in recent years that Congress has taken it upon themselves to provide FDA with additional tools in order to help ensure that that information gets developed in a timely manner. And we've seen those time frames compress in the last several years. The time from following approval to confirmatory evidence has continued to get closer and closer together. And I think that's a recognition that an accelerated approval is part of a process, not sort of an end game, but it is part of the development of the overall data that's describing the use of a drug and trying to optimize that over time.
Yeah. And Jeff, do you have any perspective on how payers react or respond to accelerated approval compared to a regular approval?
Yeah, it's been an area of examination, I think, in recent years. Traditionally in oncology, though, the National Comprehensive Cancer Center Network, or NCCN, has a system in place of developing essentially Medicare compendia. Their clinical guidelines are accepted by Medicare as sort of the guidelines that could help indicate what types of treatments should be paid for. For the most part, drugs that receive an FDA approval, including an accelerated approval, are pretty much always included in NCCN guidelines as a recommended therapy. And those processes are guided by disease area experts. They are very timely in terms of their assessment. But that process was put into place to recognize how quickly oncology drug development was moving and the need to provide access for many of these unmet medical needs. So it provides a faster way to be able to arrive at payment decisions and subsequently at the same time as treatment recommendations by leading professionals that are a reference tool for many oncologists, and that's been a really important process to support access over the last several years.
Yeah.
But if I could though, just follow that up. Can what I'm hearing though is that if it is a drug that goes through the accelerated approval, generally it will be covered, right? And there'll be, I assume they'll put in place the regular utilization management tools that'll, programs that they'll have, right? Is that fair to say? Just quickly, like, is that?
Yes, drugs that are included in the NCCN compendia in their guidelines are required to be covered by Medicare, and numerous different private payers follow the NCCN guidelines as well.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Good. Okay.
You want to go take it, Scott?
Well, I was just going to try to help us net all this out. So, and so I was just, if you could step back, Jeff, then and take the perspective of a thoughtful policymaker here, looking at the functioning of the program over the last number of years, the kind of data that Bridget was, is it on the right track or does it need some adjustment, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's proven over time to be a very beneficial tool for providing timely access to beneficial medications. Now, where there can be tweaks, like most things, there can be tweaks, then we should always be looking for program enhancements. I think the ability for longitudinal data capture, sort of post-market data, is one opportunity to help develop supporting evidence following an accelerated approval. And some of that has been helped to be encouraged through recent policy in order to ensure that the information is developed as rapidly as possible. On the flip side, I think there is also opportunities to look at the programs that are available for rigorous endpoint development. Certainly we advocate for substantial evidence to be able to support any early endpoint being used in a clinical trial. That's what we're looking to do with the ctDNA project. And having processes in place for different research organizations to be able to work directly with the FDA to make sure that that evidence is generated in an agreeable fashion, to make sure that it is as rigorous as possible for any new endpoints that might be utilized for an accelerated approval into the future, could be an important enhancement to the program.
Yeah. Thanks. Bridget, anything you'd add?
I think everything Jeff said was excellent. I think what we wanted to bring to the table with this research and the research that Jeff's group has done is context. Okay, as he said, there's always things you can improve. There's always different things to look into. But sometimes, at least we felt, if you were listening to some of the critiques, it would be easy to walk away thinking most are withdrawn and they never convert and they're based on flimsy endpoints. And what we think is very important is look at the data and look at the evidence. And when we did that, that's just not the case. And we just want to make sure, even if good policy decisions and changes to the program need to be grounded in that evidence and that perspective of what happens to patients and versus the process and pieces of the program. So as long as we're keeping that front and center, I think we'll make the right decisions around the program.
Thanks.
Great. Well, this brings us to the final question of this episode, and that is where we allow our guests to have the magic wand, and that is like, if you could do anything to improve access and affordability. So let's start with Bridget. Let's start with you. What would be your prescription for better access?
My prescription's simple. I'm going to sound like a broken record. We need good policy research. The more this kind of research we do, the better I think our policies will be, and therefore the better the outcomes will be for patients. And I think we just need to make sure, especially in today's day and age, it's really easy to get captured by the headlines and the debate and the critiques. And we shouldn't be basing policy decisions on concepts and headlines and the issue of the day. We should be basing it on really good evidence and what's happening to patients, and constantly asking that question: what does this mean for the people who need these treatments? If we do that, I think we're in good shape.
Great. Jeff?
Yeah, I think, with technology moving so quickly, it affords a lot of opportunities, both in terms of new drugs that are in the pipeline, but also the tools that could be available to identify those that are working. And if we think about the patients that could benefit from these types of programs, there unfortunately are a lot of unmet medical needs that are still out there. So having timely access and being able to work through these important processes quickly is really critical. So thinking about a process that can help validate these endpoints as efficiently as possible to make sure that we're relying on the new technology and that the technology is performing sufficiently. To do some of that up front, I think will strengthen the program further, but also maintain that critical component of timely access for the people who need access to these drugs.
Great. Well, excellent. Well, how about that, Scott? Pretty exciting, huh?
Yeah, it's good stuff. It was a great discussion. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us. Now, please stay with us to see how good listeners Scott and I are. Scott, you want me to go, or you want to go first? Like, what are some of the, for the listeners, what are some of the takeaways you have from today's discussion?
Sure. Well, I was, so I'm going to come back to the question about, like, what are we trying to achieve, and what's the criticism really about, and all those kinds of things. And this is a value judgment, and those are always challenging. But anyway, I was struck that 55, if I get the numbers right, as Jeff's saying, 55% of the drugs have convert to a regular approval. Only 15% are withdrawn, and in the middle, 30% are still pending. They're still undergoing the assessment for that, final determination. And moreover, that the assessments, those final determinations are, on average, they're taking 3 to 4 years, and the timelines are getting shorter over time. And so it just strikes me like, again, if I think of myself as a patient or a family member, like that balance of like 55% converting to this was right, and we got 3 extra years or 4 extra years of access, and 30% still pending, and 15%, we missed and we withdrew it. That feels roughly okay to me. That doesn't feel like a super controversial spot to be. I am aware, obviously, of the criticisms of the industry about dragging their feet on these things, and that is not, defensible and excusable. The executives in the industry that I speak to are clued into that, and they're working very hard to try to make sure that these trials are done and that their peers are doing so as well. And I think that's important. So I don't think we should excuse that at all. But in the end, and this won't be any surprise, to you, Mark, or our listeners, I'm sure, but it feels to me in some respects then kind of like a proxy for a pricing debate. And and that's important. Pricing is important, and total spending on cancer care or whatever, drugs as a component, that's important. But it's a separate set of issues, and it should be, in my view, it should be acknowledged and discussed openly, rather than kind of through other kinds of things where we're going to argue about other value judgments. But anyway, that's it. That's my own. It's a personal, value judgment. So.
No, I think you're exactly right. I'm going to tackle the pricing thing right up front, right? There's nothing that would happen where payers would want to pay 3 years sooner.
Yeah.
On a drug. There's just nothing. Payers would not want to pay 3 years sooner. And at the same time, I mean, we've been doing that. You and I have been doing this long enough. We remember Gleevec, right? We remember when it, was through the accelerated approval process. It changed lives. Like it took kids who were dying of leukemia and cured them. Like it's just like this miracle. It was just this incredible drug. Nobody wanted to pay for it 3 years early. If you're on the patient side, these are the lifelines. These are the things that you hope for, right? This gives you hope to keep going and to keep fighting, so that you're there for when the next, drug might become available. So I think that that's critically important, and there's probably nothing that could be done unless we, deal with some of the bigger issues that we have that you and I are trying to solve with this podcast. And but as it relates to the accelerated approval program, I think it's one of the jewels of the United States, right? And that's the way we should be looking at it. This is a national treasure. In this country, we have access to life-saving drugs that are available years before the rest of the world, right?
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes gets lost. I also do think that the whole concept of informing policy, because Jeff and I are both in Washington, D.C., and we all know that unfortunately too many people on Capitol Hill are right out of school. They don't have the experience. You're meeting with them and you're thinking, you're 23 years old. Like, how could you be writing this piece of legislation? And I know I'm going to upset all of our listeners on Capitol Hill. But my point there is to have the evidence, to make these informed decisions, I think is critically important. And then finally, on the issue of the circulating tumor DNAs, which could be its own subject for a podcast down the road, because I know there's companies out there now that are just testing for it and doing a whole host of other things. I think we have to get ready to embrace whatever new surrogate endpoint comes along, and no one, once in my case, my mother was diagnosed with late stage cancer. If you would have found that, earlier, you would have taken it. It would have had a different course for her. So these are the things where I think that we just have to sort of embrace them and adopt them. So anyways, a few more points.
It's an interesting set of topics, and I'm thankful to people like Bridget and Jeff, as you said, for helping us be better informed.
Yes. And so with that, Bridget, thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff, thank you for joining us. Hope you've enjoyed your time and the interview. And for all of our listeners, thank you for, again, joining us for another episode of Prescription for Better Access with my incredible co-host, Dr. Scott Howell. And we will have show notes and access for you to guys learn more information about all of these topics, and look forward to joining you for the next episode. So thank you.